The wind rolled across the dry plain like a wandering spirit carrying dust, distant memories, and the quiet ache of people who had lost more than they ever spoke about. The old mission stood alone with cracked white walls and a bell that no longer rang. A reminder that not every prayer was answered the way hearts hoped it would be. A woman in a dark dress stepped out of its shade, holding her shawl close, as if the sun tried to burn through more than cloth. She was known in those parts, but not in the way folks wished to be known. Travelers whispered about her past. Ranch hands lowered their voices when she was near town, and no one dared ask her what she needed or how she survived each passing winter. Her land stretched wider than the eye could count, yet her home felt empty like a house still waiting for its true purpose. She lived alone in the big cabin near the dried-up creek, and the silence inside those walls had grown so heavy that some nights she felt it pressing down on her chest more than grief ever did. People recalled that she once smiled, with the kind of hope that made others believe they could borrow some. But life in the old American frontier was not gentle to everyone. Some hearts learned to beat quietly so they did not break completely. She had loved, and she had lost, and the land she kept became a burden she never asked for. The cattle had left long ago, the wheat refused to grow, and most of her neighbors had moved on after the long drought. Still she remained, telling herself that leaving would mean she had nothing left to stand for. Yet deep inside, she knew that staying alone forever would turn her into another ghost of the desert. Rumors also spoke of a lone Apache man seen near the hills, one who did not belong to any known camp nearby. Some said he had been separated from his own people during a conflict. Others believed he was simply tired of war and chose to live with nature rather than fire. Hunters spotted him along the ridges at dawn, walking like he carried the whole earth's weight on his shoulders. He was strong, powerful, and quiet, and though no one dared confront him, no one reported him causing trouble. Folks learned long ago that not every man walking alone in the wilderness was a threat, and some were simply trying to survive in a world that had changed faster than they could. The first time she saw him, she was riding her old horse near the boundary line of her property. The sky burned orange behind the desert mountains, and shadows fell long across the ground. She paused, unsure if she should turn away. But something whispered inside her that running from everything was what had broken her spirit before. He stood tall, with calm eyes that did not beg and did not fear. She could not place what she saw in him at first. It was not danger, nor hatred, nor the cold distance most strangers shared. It felt more like standing near someone who understood loss without needing to speak. His clothing was simple, his hair loose, and his face carried a silence that matched her own. They stared at each other without words, and something unspoken passed between them like a question without sound. Days turned to weeks, and she found herself seeing him again in different places across the plain. Neither approached too closely, yet neither avoided the other. She noticed how he watched the horizon like he expected something to return that never did. She wondered if he ever woke in the middle of the night hoping to hear a familiar voice or footsteps that belonged to someone he could no longer reach. She knew that feeling too well. She never spoke of her pain, but that silence inside her grew heavier every season, and it carved her strength into something thin and fragile. She wanted meaning again, a reason to look at tomorrow as more than another day to survive. One late afternoon, after a restless night and another morning of empty rooms, the woman gathered enough courage to seek him directly. She found him near an abandoned well, where the desert breeze seemed softer, almost protective. Her footsteps were slow, her heart pounding like it feared both rejection and hope. She stopped a few feet away, unsure how to begin, unsure how to explain the kind of loneliness that could swallow a soul whole. He turned toward her, waiting silently, his expression calm and unreadable. There was no anger, no suspicion, only patience, which startled her more than anything. Her voice trembled as she spoke, as if each word weighed more than her breath. She told him that she lived alone on the ranch, with no family left to share her life or the land she owned. She explained that the world felt too wide and too empty for one person to carry forever. She did not know how to phrase the ache in her chest, but she tried anyway, saying she wished for a chance to build something new, something that gave her a place to belong. As she spoke, She feared he would turn away and vanish into the hills forever, leaving her confession to dry in the sun like all the other things she once loved. He listened, unmoving, his gaze steady, like he was hearing not only her words, but the quiet truths beneath them. She glanced at the ground before whispering what she had never said aloud to anyone since the emptiness took over her life. She told him she wanted a family again, not just a house or a name or a grave to visit. She wanted laughter inside walls, footsteps on the porch, and a reason to wake without feeling lost. Her voice cracked, but she held her breath, knowing this moment would change her fate one way or another, before fear could swallow her courage. She lifted her eyes and spoke the words that would forever bind their story to that desert land. She told him she would give him every acre she owned, every piece of soil from the riverbed to the far ridge, if he helped her build a family. Not as a business deal, not as a desperate bargain, but as a plea from a soul that had carried too much sorrow for too long. She waited for him to reject her, to walk away, to say she was foolish for believing two broken lives could create something whole. Instead, he stood quietly, the wind pulling gently at his hair, and his eyes softened with something she could not translate yet. She felt like time paused, holding its breath for his answer. For a moment, it seemed as if the silent desert listened too. Ready to witness something no one in the region would ever forget, he finally stepped forward. But before he opened his mouth, something moved in the distant dust behind him. Something she could not yet recognize. Something that might change everything. Before he even responded, he turned his head slightly, as if he sensed something long before she did. The woman narrowed her eyes and tried to see through the rising dust. Yet the sun sat low behind the hills and made it hard to tell what approached. At first it looked like nothing more than the wind running across dry ground. But soon a thin shadow grew larger, moving toward them at a steady pace. The Apache man stood in silence, his shoulders tightening, not in panic, but in careful awareness. She wondered if it could be an animal, maybe a stray horse that escaped a nearby ranch, or a traveler trying to reach the old mission before nightfall. She opened her mouth to ask him what he thought it was, but he lifted his hand slightly to signal her to stay silent. He watched with steady patience, and she realized he knew the land far better than she ever had. As the shape drew nearer, it became clear it was not a single rider, but two horses pulling something that moved unevenly, as if one wheel was loose or damaged. The sound of rattling wood and metal reached them along with faint voices. She could not tell if they were friendly or trouble, and she felt her breath tighten. She wondered if news from town had spread too far. If someone had heard her speaking to the Apache man, or seen them together from afar. People around that region did not trust Isley. Alliances between outsiders and settlers always caused questions no one wanted to answer. She stepped back slightly, not wanting to seem afraid, but unable to hide the fear that rose in her chest. The Apache man stayed still, watching with a calm posture, his eyes hidden behind the golden light. His silence gave her a strange comfort, as if no matter what approached, he would face it directly rather than run. When the wagon finally drew close enough, she recognized an old couple from the other side of the valley. They were known for selling goods, seeds, and water barrels when they could, and for collecting stories they later whispered as warnings. The woman on the wagon looked tired, her face pale under the brim of her hat. The man driving showed the kind of strain that long travels and illness can carve into skin. They slowed the horses as soon as they saw the Apache man standing there, and for a moment it seemed like the world froze between two different histories. The old man spoke first, his voice rough, as if he had been coughing for days. He asked the woman if everything was all right, since they never saw anyone this far from the road at dusk. She nodded and tried to respond naturally, though her heart beat fast. She said she was out for a short ride and noticed someone nearby, so she came to check if he needed help. The old couple exchanged a glance, the kind that carried unspoken warnings. Their eyes moved back to the Apache man, and the old woman asked if he belonged to a nearby camp. He did not answer. Instead, he watched them without showing fear or anger. The silence unsettled them, and the woman hurried to say they meant no harm. After a few tense breaths, the old woman explained they were headed toward the mission because the younger of their two sons had fallen sick. They hoped the well still had enough water to cool him down, and maybe someone inside had herbs left from the old days. The woman quickly offered help, saying she could bring clean water from her place if needed. But the old man shook his head, saying they only stopped to make sure she was safe. Before leaving, he leaned slightly and whispered that she should be cautious in these lands, since not all strangers carried peace. His voice carried more fear than advice. When they continued down the trail, the woman stood still until the wagon disappeared again behind the ridge. She turned back toward the Apache man, unsure how to continue. The question she had asked earlier now hovered heavier than before. He had not refused, but he had not accepted either. She realized she had asked something that required more than a simple answer. He studied her for a moment, and his eyes carried a reflection of something hidden. Maybe pain or memories that did not belong to that moment. She tried to speak, but he turned and walked slowly toward the hills, leaving her with no answer and no promise. She felt both relief and disappointment as she watched him move farther away, his tall figure blending with the desert colors. That night she barely slept. She sat near her window where the moonlight slipped through, lighting the room with a soft, pale glow. She wondered if she had said the wrong words or if she had opened a wound inside him. She tried to understand his silence, though she barely understood her own heart anymore. Her land was big, but her fears were bigger. She feared growing old without a voice calling her name, without a hand reaching for hers in the dark, without any child running across the porch or asking questions about life. She thought about the Apache man and how he seemed to carry his sorrow with controlled strength. She wondered if he ever dreamed of starting over somewhere away from the past. The next morning she walked outside with the hope she might see him near the hills. But the land was quiet. She saddled her horse and rode slowly toward the boundary line again, but there were no fresh tracks. She searched near the well, near the tall rocks, and near the dry riverbank, but found nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before, as if the land remembered what she had said, and now waited for her to face her thoughts alone. As the days passed, she found herself thinking more about who he really was. She knew the old frontier stories people spread. Stories of warriors who lost their families during broken treaties, of children taken from camps, of men forced to choose between staying with their people or surviving in a world that no longer recognized them. She wondered if his quiet nature came from trying to protect what was left inside him. She also thought about what she offered him, and whether it sounded like an escape or a trap. She wanted a family, but she also wanted someone who could stand beside her by choice, not desperation. She spent her evenings fixing things around the ranch that had been broken for too many years. She patched the barn door, tightened the fence rails, and cleaned the porch where dust always settled. While working, she tried to imagine what life would look like if someone else lived there with her. Would it feel warm again? Or would the shadows still linger no matter how many candles were lit? She kept reminding herself that she did not offer her land out of weakness, but because she wanted to plant new roots with someone who understood survival, not greed. She also felt the land itself had stories hidden beneath every rock and hill. Some days she heard bird calls where none had been heard before, and wondered if they carried messages from unseen spirits. She even found small hand carvings on a stone near the hill, patterns she had never noticed in all her years. She wondered if they belonged to him or someone from long ago. The carvings looked like symbols of family, protection, and belonging. She placed her palm over them gently, as if asking for guidance. One afternoon, near sunset, she stood outside watching the sky turn warm. She whispered into the wind that she meant what she had said, hoping somehow it would reach him. She told the wind she was ready for a life that had meaning again, even if it required rebuilding from a broken past. That night she left a small lantern burning outside the ranch door, not as a signal, but as a sign that her heart remained open. Then on the fourth night, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow and steady, not rushed, not lost, and not from a stranger passing by. She sat up, breath frozen, unsure if this would bring hope or danger. The moonlight slid across the floor as the shadow approached the porch, and she heard someone stop right at the threshold. She knew without looking who it was. And she also knew that whatever he came to say next would change everything. Either rebuilding two lives or breaking them beyond repair, The woman stayed frozen in her bed, her breath shallow as the quiet footsteps rested just beyond her door. She could see the faint outline of a tall figure through the thin curtain that covered the window, the lantern light casting shadows that shifted with the wind. For a moment, she wondered if she had dreamed it, if loneliness had finally begun playing tricks on her mind. But then she heard the soft scrape of boots on wood, slow and cautious, as if the person outside did not want to startle her, yet still needed to be heard. Her heart pounded so hard she feared it might echo into the night. She placed her bare feet on the cool floor and walked slowly toward the door, each step careful, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. Before she touched it, there came a gentle knock. Not a heavy one, not demanding, more like a question. She opened the door an inch, and the wind pushed the scent of the desert into the room. He stood there, the Apache man, framed by moonlight like he was a part of the land itself. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried something deeper than before, something that made her throat tighten. She whispered his name softly, though she wasn't even sure he had told her one. He answered with a slight nod before stepping back so she could see him better. He glanced toward the distant hills, and then back at her, as if making sure no one had followed him. She felt the weight of that small, protective motion, and it stirred something warm yet unsettling inside her. He spoke quietly, telling her he had heard her words near the well and that they had followed him long after he walked away. He said he did not come for the land she offered, but because he sensed her loneliness like a reflection of his own. He explained that long before he wandered these plains alone, he belonged to a small family far north. But a sickness took their children, and a raid took what remained of their peace. His voice carried no anger, only a steady tiredness that made her eyes sting. She realized then that she had guessed only a fragment of his pain. The rest was buried deep beneath silence. She invited him inside, but he hesitated, glancing toward the dark horizon again. She understood this uncertainty. A home was not just a set of walls. It was a place one had to trust. She stepped back and told him he could enter only if he chose to, not because she needed anything from him. After a long moment, he stepped into the warm glow of the lantern. She watched his eyes move slowly across the room, noticing the worn wooden table, the empty rocker near the fireplace, the unburned candles stacked neatly on the shelf. Everything felt simple and quiet, like the home had been waiting for something to fill it. He sat by the window, where moonlight cast shadows across half his face. She sat near him, unsure how close she should be. He finally spoke again, saying her offer was something he could not take lightly. A family was not a bargain, he said. It was a promise, a path that required trust and shared life, not desperation. She lowered her gaze, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks, afraid he thought she had asked out of weakness. But he gently told her he understood why she spoke the way she did, because he once felt the same ache to belong. Before either could continue, a faint howl echoed across the plains. Not an animal, not the wind. She rose and moved to the door, peering into the darkness. He stood behind her with sudden alertness, his posture sharpening. He told her there were riders out there, not close yet, but near enough that he sensed their movement earlier. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. She asked if they were dangerous, but he did not answer right away. Instead, he told her that people travel these lands for many reasons. Some seek shelter, some seek trade, and others seek things that do not belong to them. That night, neither slept. He stood guard near the window while she sat near the fire, poking at the embers whenever her thoughts grew too loud. She wanted to ask him what the riders might want, but she feared the truth more than the silence. At dawn, he walked outside to check the tracks while she prepared a small pot of boiled beans and bread. When he returned, she saw tension in his shoulders. He told her there had been 3 horses circling near the boundary, lines watching the ranch from different angles. Her stomach tightened. She asked if they were from town, but he said the tracks were not from any settlers he knew. The horses were light, fast, and carried sharp-edged shoes used by men who traveled often and hid their camps far from towns. She realized then that the ranch held more value than she ever understood. The land stretched over old riverbeds, hidden springs, and untouched grazing fields. Many families had wanted it years ago, but her late husband refused every offer. She wondered if someone believed the land was unprotected now, as the day warmed. He told her they needed to walk the property so he could understand the risks. She agreed and saddled her horse. They rode together across the wide fields, moving past old fences and dry grass. She pointed out the boundary markers, the abandoned water trough, and the crumbled stone walls that once held sheep. He listened quietly, taking in every detail as if mapping it in his mind. At one point, they discovered fresh tracks near the northern ridge. He crouched down, brushing his fingers over the prints. Someone had been watching, waiting, timing their movements. She felt panic rise in her chest, but he told her not to fear. Fear clouded judgment, and judgment was what they needed most now. He asked if anyone from town knew she lived alone. She nodded, explaining the old couple from the wagon and a few traders who passed by from time to time. He asked if any had ever shown interest in her land. She paused, thinking hard. Then she remembered a man from months earlier, a stranger from the east who came asking about property lines. He spoke too confidently, offered too much money, and left with a strange look when she said the land was not for sale. She had not thought about him since, but now she wondered if he had returned. They rode farther east, toward the rocky hills where the wind whistled through narrow cracks. She noticed the Apache man slowing his horse, eyes narrowed. He dismounted and motioned for her to stay back. She watched as he climbed a short distance, bent over something hidden behind a boulder, and returned with a piece of cloth torn from a saddlebag. It had a strange mark burned into it, like a symbol from a group that traveled far from peaceful settlements. He said the riders might not come for the land alone. They might come for control, water, or even the chance to claim territory near the hills. She felt her hands grow cold around the reins. For years she had thought her solitude kept her safe. Now she realized it only made her a target. She looked at the cloth again, wondering what kind of men left warnings instead of footprints. When they returned to the ranch, he told her he needed time to think. A decision like the one she asked him for required understanding not only of her heart, but of the danger surrounding her. He said that creating a family meant building a safe place first, one that no one could threaten or take away. She felt a mix of hope and fear, unsure if he leaned toward staying or leaving, as dusk returned. She stood on the porch while he paced the yard, scanning every direction. It struck her how naturally he moved across the land, as if he had already stepped into the role of protector even without agreeing to anything. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched the way he studied the hills, the way his eyes followed the fading light, the way his breath stilled when he sensed something others would miss. Later, as the sky darkened, he turned to her and said they could not stay unprepared. Something was coming. He felt it. The winds carried unease instead of calm. She asked him what they should do. He looked at her for a long moment, his face shadowed by the lantern flame. He said they must learn what the riders wanted, why they circled the land, and whether danger was closer than it appeared. Then he told her something that sent a shiver through her. The riders had not approached the house yet because they were waiting for night, waiting for the moment when defenses were weakest and fear worked fastest. She stepped back, gripping the edge of the door to steady herself. She asked him how he knew. He answered simply, with eyes filled not with fear but hard truth. He had once been like them. He knew their silence, their patience, and their footsteps in the dark. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a deep gold shadow. The quiet between them grew heavy, and somewhere out in the vast silence of the plains, she sensed movement she could not see, a threat creeping closer while the man inside her home stood, ready for something she could not yet name. Night settled over the land like a heavy blanket, and the quiet felt different than any evening she had lived through before. It was not peaceful silence. It was silence that seemed to listen back. The Apache man stood outside for a long time, scanning the distant hills. While she remained near the doorway with a lantern held low, she could feel her pulse in her fingertips, and every soft movement in the dry grass made her turn her head. She kept reminding herself that this was still her home, that she had lived through storms, loss, hunger, and bitter winters without breaking, yet the unknown always tested the strongest hearts. He finally stepped inside and asked her to lock all doors and put out every visible light except one small lantern. He said that when strangers watched from the dark, any small detail could reveal more than words. She followed his instructions without question, surprised by how naturally she trusted him. She placed the lantern near the hearth, letting it cast only a gentle glow, and moved close enough to feel his presence beside her. He told her they would not hide, but they also would not wait blindly. She asked if he expected trouble that very night. He answered that trouble rarely warned before arriving. She suggested they ride to town at first light, but he shook his head. He said if they left, whoever wanted the land would think they ran out of fear, and fear had a way of inviting pursuit. He spoke calmly, but she could sense his thoughts moving quickly, measuring every possibility. He asked if there was anyone she trusted who might be willing to help. She thought about it and mentioned a ranch family that lived 2 valleys over. People who kept to themselves and had always treated her kindly. But she also knew sending for help meant someone had to leave the ranch, and traveling alone in that moment seemed unsafe. He suggested they look over the ranch buildings before dawn, searching for weak spots in fences, doors, and windows. They walked through the quiet barn, their footsteps soft on the dusty floor. She noticed the way he touched wood beams and hinges, checking strength without speaking much. He examined the ground, looking for prints that might have come too close. When he paused, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but he only pointed at old marks made by jackrabbits. She let out a small breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Inside the barn, she found herself staring at an old cradle her husband once built, though it had never been used. It leaned against the far wall, covered in dust. She touched its edge, and when she looked up, she saw the Apache man watching her quietly, not with pity, but with understanding. She explained that she once believed a family would fill the ranch with laughter, footsteps, and futures that reached beyond fences. He walked closer and said gently that dreams do not die, they simply wait. She felt her eyes warm, but she kept her tears inside. Knowing this was not a night for breaking, they left the barn and walked toward the back field where an old windmill stood still. Its blades turned slowly in the breeze, creaking like a whisper of past seasons. She recalled how her husband once planned to build a new system that could bring water closer to the house. She had not finished it alone, and the half-built structure reminded her that life sometimes paused in the middle when hearts were hurt. The Apache man studied the windmill and said it could still work if repaired. She was surprised he noticed such things, and he quietly replied that land always reveals what it can still give. Not only what it has lost. As they made their way back to the house, a faint sound drifted through the night air, like a soft metallic ring or a saddle stirrup brushing against stone. They both froze, eyes shifting toward the northern ridge. Nothing moved, yet the sound was real enough to stir every worry back to the surface. He motioned for her to step behind him, and she felt a cold shiver run through her. For several long moments they watched the darkness, waiting for movement, but nothing broke through. He finally guided her back inside and told her they would rest in turns. She stood near him longer than needed, as if leaving his side might allow fear to fill the space again. She offered him a blanket, but he said he would stay awake a little longer to listen to the land. She went to her room, but she left the door open, comforted by the quiet sound of his footsteps near the window. She lay down on the edge of her bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to slow her thoughts. But every creak of the house pulled her back into awareness. Sometime near dawn, she drifted to sleep and woke to the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. She walked out quietly and saw him standing near the stove, the first morning light touching his shoulders. He handed her a cup without many words, and for a moment the world felt almost normal. After they ate, he said they needed to ride near the riverbed, as he felt something kept drawing his thoughts there. She agreed, and they prepared their horses. The ride to the riverbed was silent except for the steady rhythm of hooves. When they reached it, she noticed something strange. A section of the riverbank looked disturbed, as if someone tried digging or searching for something. He kneeled down and inspected the area, finding faint signs of tools, maybe maps or markers left behind. He asked if she ever heard stories about hidden springs or old trails beneath her land. She said she recalled hearing her husband speak once of a rare water source buried deep under certain points, one that could change the future of anyone who found it. The Apache man looked up with steady seriousness. He told her that water meant life and control in the old frontier, far more valuable than cattle or crops. If someone believed her land hid a hidden spring, they would return until they found it or claimed it. She felt her throat tighten as she realized the threat was larger than property or greed. It meant someone out there planned for long-term gain, not a simple raid or chance visit. On the way back, storm clouds began forming over the far horizon, blowing sand into the wind. The air smelled tense, and lightning flickered through distant clouds. The Apache man watched the sky and said storms could drive people to desperate choices. She gripped her reins harder and prayed silently that the land would not witness more loss. When they reached the ranch, they discovered something that stopped both of them in their tracks. One of the porch boards had fresh mud prints that did not belong to either of them. He crouched near them, touching the edges. The soil was not from her land or the field they had crossed. It came from somewhere damp and hidden, meaning someone had been close enough to touch her home while they were gone. She felt weak in her knees, clinging to the railing. He stood to face her and said there was no turning back now. Whoever watched them knew their routines, and they had limited time to secure what mattered most. She tried to speak, but her voice broke, and he stepped close enough that she could see steadiness in his eyes, not fear. He told her that she was not alone, not anymore, unless she chose to be. She looked at him, realizing that even without speaking the words, something between them was no longer the same. As afternoon slid into evening, they prepared quietly. He gathered wood, strengthened the doors, and checked the ground again. She packed a small bag of important things, unsure if she would ever need to leave quickly. The wind blew harder, rattling the shutters, and the clouds darkened until only streaks of faint light broke through. Right before night arrived fully, they both heard the sound they had been waiting for, but fearing. Horses in the distance, slow, controlled, and circling, not rushing. The Apache man stood tall, his face calm, eyes sharp. He told her to stay near the back of the house until he called for her. She wanted to protest, but she understood trust was now their strongest weapon. The sound grew louder, hooves striking ground with slow confidence. Whoever approached was not afraid. She stepped back to the doorway, her heart pounding loud enough she feared it would give away her hiding place. The Apache man stood out in the open yard, facing the direction of the sound, not hiding, not running. His silence became as strong as steel. Wind howled across the plain. Lightning flashed behind the distant hills, and the riders finally appeared on the ridge. Outlined by the storm's sky like dark silhouettes against fate, they did not speak, but their presence alone told her the moment she feared had finally arrived, setting the stage for a choice that would decide not only her future, but the future of everything she hoped to build again. The Apache man stood steady in the yard, facing the silhouettes on the ridge with no sign of fear in his eyes. The tension thickened with every gust of wind, and the storm clouds overhead felt like they were holding their breath along with the land. The riders slowly approached until she could make out 3 figures wearing long coats and wide hats pulled low, their horses stomping at the dry ground as if impatient. She stayed near the doorway, not hiding fully, but still protected by the shadows. Her heart raced with both fear and determination, because now she understood something she had not seen clearly before. The ranch was more than land, more than memories, and more than the past. It was a place waiting to be filled. It's not taken. One of the riders stepped forward and lifted his hat, and even in the fading light she recognized him. He was the same man who had visited months ago, the one who had tried to buy her land with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. He called out, asking to speak calmly, claiming he only wanted a fair offer. The Apache man remained silent, his presence alone drawing a boundary no one else could see. She walked out slowly and stood beside him, her voice steady as she said the land was not for sale. Not now and not ever. The stranger tried again, saying he knew there was more hidden beneath the soil, that he had maps and proof that the land contained value far beyond cattle or grain. She answered that the land's worth was not measured by what it could profit, but by what it could shelter. When he began insisting louder, The Apache man stepped forward and spoke for the first time. He told them that if they believed land gave them power, they misunderstood the earth. Power came from how land was cared for, not from owning it like a trophy. He warned them that some things should remain untouched if they were not earned through honor. A sharp silence fell, broken only by thunder rolling across the sky. She saw a flicker of uncertainty in the rider's eyes, not because of threat, but because his conviction felt heavier than any weapon. One of the riders whispered to the leader, urging him to leave. The leader hesitated, staring at the Apache man with frustration. But eventually he turned his horse to leave, not because he agreed, because he realized there was no space for victory where two souls stood, ready to protect something deeper than land. Before leaving, he warned that the world was changing, and chances do not last forever. The Apache man responded by saying some chances are not meant to be taken at all. With that, the riders rode away into the storm shadows. Their silhouettes swallowed by the night, the wind eased, as if danger had slipped out of reach, and only then did she feel her knees weaken. The Apache man gently placed his hand on her shoulder to steady her. She could feel strength there, not force. She whispered her thanks, her voice cracked with relief, an emotion she had been holding for too long. He told her that she was brave because she spoke with truth, and truth carried more power than any blade. They walked back inside, closing the door, not out of fear, but to start breathing again. Later, when the storm finally broke and rain tapped against the roof, they sat together near the quiet fire. She told him how she never expected anyone to stand beside her after so many empty years. He said he had not planned to stay anywhere ever again, but the land and her strength reminded him of what could still grow. She looked into his eyes and said her offer for family was not made out of fear or loneliness anymore. This time she offered it with hope. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, and said he could not promise a perfect future, but he could promise to build one with honesty, patience, and respect. Days passed without any sign of the riders returning. The ranch slowly changed as they worked side by side. The Apache man repaired the windmill, bringing water closer to the house. She planted a small garden again, with seeds she once kept, but never had courage to use. He carved new wooden posts for the fences. She repainted the window frames, so the house no longer looked like it waited for goodbye. The land began to show signs of life again, as if it responded to the care of two people who wanted to share purpose instead of claiming ownership. In town, rumors spread of a new partnership on the ranch. But when people eventually visited, they saw not fear or dispute, but calm cooperation. The old couple from the wagon returned months later and found both the woman and the Apache man greeting them at the porch. With fresh vegetables growing nearby and gentle smoke rising from the chimney, they noticed peace in their faces and did not ask questions that belonged to private hearts. They instead offered seeds and warm smiles, promising to bring more goods before winter. As seasons changed, hope returned in small, natural ways. Birds returned to rest on fence rails. Grass grew thicker near the windmill, and sunlight felt warmer on the porch. The Apache man taught her how to read signs of weather, how to understand soil, and how to listen to the land instead of forcing it. She taught him how to keep a home steady, how to cook recipes she once feared she would never use for anyone, and how love could be spoken through small actions instead of grand words. They never rushed anything, because healing and building deserved slow steps. Eventually, the house no longer felt empty. The sound of footsteps, laughter, and mornings, shared over coffee, filled the space that once echoed with silence. The cradle in the barn was brought into the house, not as a reminder of loss, but as preparation for new beginnings. The family she wanted, and the belonging he needed, started shaping itself through days of togetherness, not desperation. One evening, as the sun painted the hills gold and the wind felt gentle, they stood at the edge of the field, overlooking their land. She looked at him and said she was grateful that he returned that night, grateful he did not walk away from her request. He answered that she was the one who opened a door no one had dared to knock on, not with fear, but with courage. She smiled softly and said, "Love grows best where it is chosen, not demanded." He nodded and took her hand. Not as a deal, not as a bargain, but as a promise that both hearts would walk forward together. Their ranch became known not for hidden treasure or secret water, but for unity, healing, and hope. People who visited said they felt peace there, something rare in the old American frontier. The lonely widow was no longer spoken of with sadness, and the Apache man was no longer seen as a wanderer without place. They built a home, a family, and a future based on trust and shared strength. The land stayed with them, not as property, but as a part of their story that held roots, love and new beginnings. And in the quiet nights, when stars covered the sky like a blanket of promises, neither of them felt alone again.